Grace and peace. I'm Brian Musser, the Baptist campus minister at Drexel University, and this is Peace and Power Christian Fellowship. The peace of Jesus Christ to change your life, the power of the Holy Spirit to change the world. We are continuing our series on the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 through 7, words that changed the world. And this week we're looking at something a little bit different. This is lesson 5, and we're looking at sex and sexuality in the teachings of Jesus. And this idea stems from verses we looked at in the previous lesson, lesson 4. Jesus uses 6 illustrations. 2 of those illustrations are specifically dealing with sexuality, sex, marriage, divorce. The first one talks about adultery, and also Jesus brings it into lust. And then the second one talks about divorce as well. So as Jesus is going over these topics in the Sermon on the Mount, I thought it was appropriate to take a break from moving on to new topics and looking back in closer detail these 2 examples that Jesus pulls out during the Sermon on the Mount. This is the second video of lesson 5. We're going to specifically be talking about sex and sin, and we're going to look very closely at the words of Jesus there in the Sermon on the Mount. The previous lesson gave kind of an overarching view of how sex and sexuality fit into discipleship as a whole, especially from the words of Jesus, connecting mostly to the great commandments: love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And with that as a reference point, we're going to look into how these specific verses that Jesus deals with in the Sermon on the Mount kind of reiterate some of those classifications, some of those qualifications that can look at overall discipleship when it comes to sex and sexuality. So without any further ado, let's look at the specific verses in the entirety. And you have heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away, for it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away, for it is better that you lose one of your members than your whole body to go into hell." It was also said, "Whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery." So, looking at these passages, we see that Jesus talks about adultery, talks about lust, talks about divorce as we're moving forward. He says, "You have heard it said, do not commit adultery, but I tell you. You have heard it said, give her a certificate of divorce, but I tell you." What would be a way, and just think creatively with me here, what would be some of those "you have heard it said"? Because these were kind of attached to Mosaic teachings, but the way they were being applied weren't quite biblical. They were more cultural in how they were being applied. So maybe in our culture it could say, "You have heard it said that sex needs to be between 2 consenting adults, but I tell you, you know that it, something more stringent than that, something a little bit different than that even if you're 2 consenting adults, you need to be able to make commitments to one another, or 2 consenting adults that are willing to trust one another." Not saying that, but there would be, you have heard it said, there's a lot of things in our culture that we teach as sexual laws and sexual legislation or sexual connotations. It'd be interesting to see what Jesus says about the things we teach about our sex and sexuality here, and how Jesus would say, "You have heard it said, but I tell you," things like that. How would we look at that? And these 3 things, I want to look at these 3 things. Adultery. Adultery is an kind of an external sexual sin. It is an action in our categories of, heart, mind, soul, strength, neighbor. It would definitely be in the strength, the physical body piece to it. It's an action we do with our bodies. Lust is an internal sexual sin that uses thought, emotions, will. So adultery is something we do with our bodies. Lust is something we do internally and doesn't necessarily have to have that physical manifestation. And then divorce is an external sexual sin in the social context. Divorce has implications for other individuals and society as a whole as well. So we're going to look at looking at adultery here is just the basic definition is when one person has committed to be sexually faithful to another through marriage and then breaks that commitment by engaging in sexual activity with someone else. So basically, I have promised myself to be faithful to my wife. Adultery is when I break that promise. So there's both the sexual activity and the breaking of the commitment due to that sexual activity as well. And thinking about this, we could look through some of these questions. How does adultery affect a person? The one who is cheated on, the one who cheats. Does adultery change who you are? As we look at these relationships, as we look at this promise and this pledge, and it's interesting that the very next example Jesus uses in the Sermon on the Mount is about keeping oaths. But this idea is, I have promised to be faithful to my wife. Adultery would mean that I have broken that promise with her. Now, that would change me in the fact it would move me from someone who is trustworthy, someone who keeps my promises, to someone who doesn't. And it would change me not only in how my wife sees me or how others see me, but it would change me in who I am. We become what we practice. So if I make it a habit of breaking promises, or if I do the justification that actually allows me to break my promises, that changes my behavior, impacts who I am. We are not just who we think we are also in part what we do, and what we do helps change who we become. So as I break promises, as I use other people outside of commitments for my own pleasure, that makes me different. Also, the one who was cheated on, we trust people because people often have been seen to us as trustworthy. We allow ourselves to be vulnerable when we feel safe. If they have made a promise, they have had a promise broken, it is often more or less likely to believe promises in the future. So, although we are the summation of our actions, we can change, and our actions can help change us. And moving forward, we will talk about how discipline can actually, and practice can actually form in us who we are in a good way and overcome past mistakes in that way. So there is a difference between someone who committed adultery once and someone who practices adultery, or someone who committed adultery but has since repented and turned from that action and is trying to establish a different set of ways they live. So it does change us, but because we are changeable, it doesn't necessarily permanently change us. We can make, through actions, through decisions, through choices, and how those choices are imprinted in who we are, we can develop new habits one way or the other. So adultery both affects the person who is committing the adultery and also the person who has been cheated on as well. And so there are those two pieces there to the part. Now, lustful intent. Using the mind to derive pleasure by imagining sexual activity with someone, often in contradiction to social context, without regard for what is best for that person. So lust is more of a mental thing, is how I imagine, how I picture, how I dream up some sort of sexual interaction that doesn't necessarily exist in the real world, just only in my mind. And usually it's with somebody who I can't or shouldn't be actually doing the action with. It's different to think about your wife who is just daydreaming about something that might happen, and if it did happen, than daydreaming about somebody you're not supposed to do the action with. And since you can't actually get away with doing the actual action, then you daydream about it and create a scenario in your mind instead of actually acting out on it. So that's kind of the lustful intent. The damage caused by lust to the individual, it seems to be permanent. Jesus says it is better to cut off limbs, gouge out eyes, than to have a lustful heart. When we decide to lust, we are using our minds in a way, and we know with neuroplasticity, we know with like porn addiction, we know with the engagements of mental images, we are actually training our brains to think a certain way. The more we practice mathematics, the more our brains can deal with numbers. The better we read, the more we read, the more our brain becomes trained to be able to read. The more we lust, the more we do sexual imaginings, the better our brain becomes at it. And we create pathways within our mind that starts developing a brain that is able to lust well, a brain that is able to lust more, a brain that lust feels more natural, and we train ourselves in lusting. Now, obviously, Jesus talks about, and this is one he's preaching a sermon using these illustrations. The cutting off hands, gouging out eyes is not going to be able to affect lust one way or the other, because lust is happening inside of us. It's not the physical activity. There are certain things we can, do to ourselves that would make it impossible for us to commit adultery, but there is very little we can do to ourselves short of a lobotomy that would make us unable to commit lust. So cutting off our hand won't stop what's going on in our minds. Cutting out our eyes won't stop what's going on inside of our minds. But the idea is that lust happens in a heart. So actually having a change of heart, having a heart that is transformed by Christ, is a legitimate idea of how to stop lust. What causes someone to lust, and lust can actually change a person. And it's our heart, it's our inner workings, it's our decisions. And sometimes lust is the result of a momentary decision. I have decided to lust at this moment. Sometimes lust becomes a habit where the decisions have been years of making these momentary decisions, and now we have trained ourselves that made lust a habit, and it's no longer a momentary decision, but it's become a lifestyle or a behavior. Lust can be a sexual activity, but it can also be a sexual activity that has been practiced so much that it becomes a sexual behavior, and that behavior actually becomes something that we don't even have to decide to do. It's something that just becomes routine for us. So that's kind of the way things are going. The heart, the place in the biblical humanity that is the seat of the will, is what causes someone to lust. Ultimately, we choose to lust, or we choose to allow ourselves to lust. So in essence, Jesus's word could be interpreted as recommending us cutting out our heart and replacing it with a new one, which is in line with Ezekiel or some Jeremiah passage that talks about the way the law interacts with the heart as well. And then the third piece here Jesus looks at is divorce. And this idea, there were loopholes created in Jesus's day to allow for adultery to be avoided and lustful intent to be enacted without feeling morally guilty or socially inappropriate. Divorce is the legal way to break the committed relationship, the commitment to be faithful to another. As practice, it created a justifiable process to obtain the desires of adultery without the felt consequences. So basically, what it was, and adultery, I'm married, I'm committed to my wife, I see someone I want more than my wife, but I have made that commitment. So divorce and the way it was practiced in Jesus's day was a way to design legal paperwork to get me out of that commitment I made to this woman so that I could pursue a commitment, pursue sexual interactions with that woman without the moral guiltiness of calling it adultery or the social ramifications of cheating on or breaking a marriage commitment that I have made. So it wasn't so much, I mean, it really wasn't talking about, Jesus wasn't really talking about the whole idea of divorce as an institution. It was about the common practice of divorce as a way to legally justify adultery. If the only thing keeping me from committing adultery is the fact that I had made this commitment to this person, and I feel obligated not to break that commitment. If I can create a legal process that allows me to break that commitment first and then pursue what would have been adultery that is now just not adultery, that's what the Jews were trying to do. They were trying to use a legal process to get out of the commitment they made to their wife, out of the commitment they made in marriage, legally, justifiably, so that they could pursue someone else without it being labeled adultery. Just because it's legal does not mean it's morally right. Just because it's legal does not mean it's righteous, does not mean it's justice. And this is the case in point. This is the idea they were getting at. They were using legal measures to justify sin. And that's what Jesus was handling at. Instead of looking for ways and what do not commit adultery meant, they were looking for ways to maneuver themselves around and still get all the fruits of what adultery would be without the legal justifications of it. So it would be like this selfishness in them that was not looking at their wife or the other person they were going to commit adultery with, but just whether or not they could do what they wanted legally. That speaks to a necessary change in the heart issues. If you're giving someone a certificate of divorce only to please your own sinfulness, then even though it's legal, doesn't make it right. So this idea, is divorce always sinful? And Jesus says, except for sexual immorality, if you are, if you divorce a woman, you're forcing her to commit adultery, which is a sin. And you're committing adultery yourself, which is a sin. Now, and this is an interesting one. Is divorce always sinful? And there's three, I think there's yes is the answer to this, but there's three reasons why yes is the answer to this. Three categories. Divorce is always sinful, but how it is sinful can vary. Divorce can be the natural consequences of sin. This would be the case of sexual immorality. If you're married to somebody, they cheat on you, and that breaks the commitment they made to you. That sin, the sin of adultery, can lead to divorce. In that case, the divorce isn't the sin. Adultery was the sin, and divorce is a consequence of the sin. one of the partners sinned against the other, and out of that sin, the consequence is divorce. Or both of the partners continue to sin against each other. Something as extravagant as the War of the Roses, where the married couple, I think it was Kirk Douglas, and I don't forget who the female lead was, but they're so sinful to one another that divorce is the consequence of that. Quite often we can sin within a marriage in such a way that that sin naturally results in divorce. It can be on the hand of one partner breaking the other partner's trust so deeply that it's irreparable, or it can be both partners sin against each other so constantly that that sin leads to divorce. The other way, this is, the next way, the divorce itself can be a sinful action by one or both people. I think this is the category Jesus is talking about in his illustration here. I sinfully want to pursue something else. But before I do that, I have to divorce, or because of my sinfulness, I choose the wrong action of divorcing my wife or I shouldn't divorce my wife. There is no real reason for me to divorce my wife, but I choose the sinful action to somehow please myself to divorce my wife. Or we both should, the divorce in this case would be wrong. We should decide to stay married, to remain committed to one another. We should intend to keep our promises. But we both, due to our own selfish nature, choose the wrong action, which is divorce. The first one and the second reason is kind of different there. There are folks in this third category where divorce is a sinful action taken by one against the other. So quite often it would be, I choose to divorce my wife, but my wife did not want that to happen. My wife wanted to stay in the marriage. My wife needed to stay in the marriage. My wife decided to keep the commitment and the promise. But because of my decision, she can't. So my sin affects her. And this is quite often what was going on in Jesus' day. Men had the power to divorce women. It was a legal standing with men that they were able to use the court of laws to divorce women. Those women were not at all intentionally involved in the divorce whatsoever. So they were divorced. They didn't get a divorce. They didn't divorce their husbands. Their husbands acted against them sinfully in this divorce. And this still happens from time to time as well, where one partner doesn't want the divorce, but the other one chooses to sinfully divorce that person as well. It gets complicated, but there are multiple ways where sin engages in divorce. Okay, whether divorce is the consequence of sin, whether divorce itself, the action of divorce, is a sin by one or both partners, or whether one partner has to suffer the sin of somebody else as they divorce them. I want to be clear here, okay? Divorce, the action, has some sort of sin connected to it. There's something that has been broken, something that has been damaged, something that has been, taken out of that, something that is wrong. But being divorced is not necessarily sinful. Okay. If you find yourself as someone who is divorced, those sins, whether or not they were yours or not, are past actions. Where you are, where you find yourself now, is a reality. I am divorced. Being divorced is not a state of sin. Maybe the divorce was a sin, but now that you are divorced, it is just a reality of where you are. It's not a state of sin. You are not forever tarnished by it. It is not an irredeemable situation. It is not even something that you should, you know, you might need to repent of the actions that went into getting divorced. But being divorced is not even something that needs to be a repentant place. It's just a fact of how you are. You know, I might, you know, have chosen to cut off my arm. Now, that probably was a sinful action, maybe a stupid action, but probably sin led to that somehow. But me walking around with one arm is not, it's the result of sin. It's not in itself sinful. We sometimes live in the consequences of previous sins, but living in those consequences is not necessarily a state of active sinfulness on our part. Hopefully that's clear, and maybe if you have questions about that, you can drop down in the comments and leave me a note. I'm trying to explain that to the best of my ability. Let me know if I need to explain it better in those sense as well. Now, what are some current cultural norms that we have created to allow for adultery and or lust to be practiced without consequences? This can be, and think about this in your own head. I think the availability of pornography within the home on electronic devices allows us to create a culture of lust, a culture of sexual lust in ways that limit the social consequences of it that were otherwise not limited in other creatures. It's still changing who we are, how we think, how we look at other people, how we deal with relationships in a very dramatic way. And there's a lot of evidence about how pornography has affected our culture and how pornography changes human brain function. But and how just how we look at people is different because of that lustful intent in pornography that there is. But it is because it's available in the house without anybody else knowing. It has been a way we have created the ability to lust and removed many of the social implications of it. Ideas within legal of no fault divorce, the way we can get in and out of marital commitments without having it lead to any sort of social legal damages is an interesting one. The fact that we even sometimes use wedding vows that have terminology like until the love ends or until we no longer, like, not instead of death do us part. We have even lowered the commitments within marriage so that they're easier to get out of. There's a lot of ways our culture has created it that adultery or lust is not just um, allowed for and allowed for without consequences, but it could even be encouraged. And think about how this affects, going back to the previous video, the fact that lust is so available. How is that changing our transformation process and becoming more like Jesus? Are we able to engage? Does lust cause us to engage other human beings in a way that limits who we see them as, that changes us away from Jesus instead of toward him? Things to think about. As always, there's 3 ways to join this conversation: in person, live Monday nights, and weekly wrap-ups on YouTube and WordPress. I am all over the social media: Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, WordPress, and YouTube. Those links are in the description below. I know this is a difficult conversation. I may have created more questions than answers. It's something I'm talking through with you, and these videos make that difficult. If this was an actual conversation, there may have been a lot more clarity as well, but hopefully you can stick with me as we talk through these things. Give me feedback. Let me know what you're thinking along these lines as well. And this is a conversation we desperately need to have, mainly because of how much sexuality affects who we are as people. Okay. I enjoyed having the conversation with you. Talk to you later.